a hidden deal with a powerful oil CEO, and a critical vote that altered the fate of the nation? Jasmine's revelations shake the very foundations of Green's empire. With the walls closing in, Green must face a reckoning unlike anything she's ever encountered. Will she survive the storm, or will her political career be ripped apart in just 5 days? What happens when the truth is too explosive to hide any longer? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the high ceilings of the Capitol hearing room, a strange tension hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Staffers shifted in their chairs, reporters scrolled absent-mindedly, and cameras rolled on what everyone assumed would be another dull, forgettable hearing. No fireworks, no headlines, just noise. But the moment Jasmine Crockett walked in, the atmosphere shifted. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She moved with quiet precision, a sealed folder in hand, and an expression that said she wasn't here to participate. She was here to confront. To most in the room, she was just another Democrat, often interrupted, often dismissed. But today, her calm presence unsettled even the seasoned aides. She took her seat slowly, placed the folder on the desk like a warning, and adjusted her jacket with steady hands. No theatrics, no words. But somehow the silence around her grew sharper, like the room knew. Something was about to break. The silence had stretched to its limit. Every breath in the room seemed to wait for someone else to speak, until Jasmine Crockett finally leaned into the mic, her voice low, steady, and undeniable, like someone about to tear the veil off a quiet betrayal. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Jasmine said, her tone calm, but beneath it lay a firmness that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. "I'd like to begin today by addressing something that, to me, strikes at the very heart of our responsibility as public servants. Trust." She paused, not for effect, but to be sure every word landed with weight. Her fingers didn't fidget. Her posture didn't falter. She was completely still, except for her eyes, locked forward, unwavering. "I believe that trust has been violated," she continued, her voice tightening just slightly, "by someone in this very room." Now the air truly changed. A ripple moved across the chamber. Chairs creaked, phones lowered. Reporters looked up from half-written notes. Jasmine didn't name her target right away. She let the suspense live, let it build into something tangible. Then, without raising her voice, without theatrics, she said, "I am referring to Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene." The name landed like a stone thrown through stained glass. You could feel the temperature drop. Greene didn't react immediately, but her spine went rigid, her fingers curling around the edge of the desk like she needed something to grip. Jasmine pressed on. She opened the dark folder before her, each motion deliberate as though removing a lock on a vault, and pulled out a single page, printed in plain black ink but charged with consequence. She held it up. "This document," she said, tapping the top corner twice, "is a summary of campaign expenditures filed with the Federal Election Commission." Her voice was louder now, not angry but unflinching. "It shows a total of $130,000 in campaign funds directed to a company called Oak Star Strategies, LLC. A few members of the committee exchanged looks. One aide in the back began typing quickly. Still, Jasmine didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The strength was in the facts. "Now here's where it gets troubling," she continued, placing the document gently on the desk like evidence in a trial. "Oak Star Strategies has no website, no verifiable office, no staff directory, no public record of clients or contracts. I called every number associated with the firm 3 times. 2 were disconnected. The third led to a voicemail with no company name. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. Nothing came back. No corporate tax filings, no state business license, no proof that this company exists in any legitimate form." She let the silence work for her. Let the realization settle in. "A company that can't be found," she said slowly, "was paid nearly $130,000 of donor money for consulting." She made air quotes without sarcasm, just clarity. Consulting no one can trace, from a company no one can verify, for work no one can describe. She turned slightly, now looking directly at Marjorie Taylor Greene. "And when the American people donate to a political campaign, Whether they're Republican or Democrat, they expect their money to go toward the campaign, not to shell companies, not to paper ghosts. Her tone was sharper now. They expect transparency, accountability, and above all, honesty. Green opened her mouth slightly, but Jasmine wasn't done. This isn't speculation, she said. It's not rumor. It's right here in the filings. These are not anonymous leaks or partisan traps. These are official documents, submitted under oath. Then she sat back, silent, but not relaxed. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply let the weight of what had just been said echo through the chamber. Let it press against the walls, heavy and unmovable. Every eye was now on her, not because she demanded it, but because they couldn't look away. The weight of Jasmine's evidence had barely settled when Marjorie Taylor Greene surged forward. Words already loaded, voice sharpened not by truth, but by fear that the walls were finally closing in. "You've got nothing but air," Greene snapped, her voice slicing through the chamber like a whip cracked too close to panic. She leaned toward the mic with both hands gripping the table, trying to reclaim control by sheer force of volume. "You're making this up. Conspiracy, fiction, lies, all of it." Her face was flushed now, not with righteous anger, but with the unmistakable heat of exposure. A few gasps murmured from the press section, but Jasmine remained still, unshaken. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at Greene, not with hostility, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had already done the homework and knew the answers wouldn't change under pressure. Then she reached, slowly, deliberately, for another document in the folder, her fingers calm as if time had slowed for her and her alone. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice perfectly measured, "what I have here isn't speculation. It's not hearsay. It's your filings. It's your signature. And it's your silence until today that makes it matter." She laid the page flat on the table, turning it just enough for the cameras to catch the heading. "Campaign Expense Reimbursement, April 2022. She didn't wave it like a weapon. She didn't dramatize it. She let the text speak for itself. "This document," she began, "details a reimbursement of $11,400 approved for a trip to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The purpose listed? Strategy meeting." She looked back up, eyes steady, voice unwavering. "And yet, no registered meeting, no public agenda, no guest list, no staff flights logged, just two names on the private jet manifest, yours and your former campaign director." Her words fell like footsteps in a hallway you didn't know someone else was walking down. "That resort," she continued, "cost $1,600 a night. The spa packages you approved, $890, charged under miscellaneous services, and the room service tab?" She glanced down briefly, almost casually. "Over $400 in alcohol, labeled as Team Morale." Greene's hands twitched. "That trip was cleared. I don't answer to your narrative," she barked, voice wobbling now, cracks forming beneath the sound. But no one on the dais backed her. No one jumped to rescue her. Jasmine stayed composed, like a surgeon with a scalpel already in motion. "This isn't my narrative," she said quietly. "It's your numbers. It's your labels. It's your campaign account funding, private luxuries under the pretense of public duty." She pushed the paper forward, slow and controlled, toward the committee clerk. "And if you don't want the public to believe what's printed here, I suggest you tell them what is missing, because I already know." That last line didn't rise in volume. It dropped in temperature, and that, more than any shout, is what made the room freeze. But just as the shock from the luxury trip was settling, Jasmine reached for a second file, one marked not just by numbers, but by voices, and with it, the entire room shifted from financial scandal to something darker, something personal. Jasmine didn't raise her hand or clear her throat. She simply unfolded the second file and looked out at the committee as if bracing them for impact. "What I'm about to present next," she said, voice low but cutting, "moves beyond questionable reimbursements. It involves political money being quietly funneled into personal real estate through a name most of us have never heard, but one that leads directly back to this chamber." She held up the page, white paper, black ink, but the tension it carried was unmistakable. I have here verified transcripts of 2 recorded phone calls between a senior aide in Representative Green's office and a financial go-between. One call took place on March 9th of last year, the second on July 15th. Both were obtained legally, reviewed by 2 outside analysts, and authenticated before submission. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but the silence in the room was anything but calm. She looked down, unfolded the page slowly, and began to read. In the March 9th recording, Green's aide says, and I quote, "We'll move $20K from Freedom Rising to Bay Rise LLC. It's clean. We need it for the beach house. She's got contractors waiting." Jasmine looked up again, and this time, the pause wasn't for dramatic effect. It was to let the weight of that sentence settle in every corner of the room. There was no interpretation, no speculation, just a direct quote implicating money, a fake company, and a property that didn't belong to the campaign or the public, but to someone close. The moment crackled. Staffers froze mid-typing. Even Green stopped fidgeting. With a deliberate motion, Jasmine slid the next document across the table, her fingers steady as she prepared to reveal not just an accusation, but a solid, undeniable trail of corruption. Jasmine's gaze didn't leave Green as she spoke. "This isn't a theory, Congresswoman. This is a documented fact." Her voice dropped lower, but the weight in her words made every syllable feel like a punch. She held up the first piece of evidence, a crisp official business registration document. "This is the business registration for Bay Rise LLC, the company that received that $20,000 from your pass. And the owner of this LLC?" She didn't need to look at the paper. She knew the name by heart. "Ronald Edgerton, your husband's brother-in-law." She paused, letting the room absorb the magnitude of the connection. It wasn't just a distant relative, someone removed from the situation. It was someone directly involved in the financial dealings that should never have crossed into personal gain. "This is the man who now owns property purchased with PAC money. This is the same man whose name appears on documents linked to a real estate deal funded by money meant for public service." Jasmine glanced at the committee, her eyes sweeping across their faces as if to ensure they were all following the simple but explosive truth she was laying out. "And this is the same company that received those funds despite having no legitimate reason to do so." The murmurs in the room were barely audible, but the unease was palpable. Jasmine knew that some might be tempted to write this off as a one-off mistake, an unfortunate misstep in the flow of campaign money. But she wasn't done. She pulled out the second document, an official bank statement, thick with red flags. The contrast between her calm and the rising tension in the room was almost too stark to ignore. "Here's the proof," she continued, letting the statement sit in front of the committee members. "This is the record of the wire transfer from the PAC account to Bay Rise LLC. It's as clear as day. The amount, $20,000. She let the words settle, every pair of eyes locked on her. "And here," she added, sliding the next document across the table, "is the internal audit report from the bank. It shows that the transaction was flagged immediately for potential fraud. The account was marked for investigation." Her voice grew colder and the room grew quieter. "And do you know what happened next?" Jasmine's eyes never left Green, whose face was beginning to show the first cracks of panic. The investigation was closed, quietly, without a peep. No action, no follow-up. The case was buried, no public record, no transparency, just an unspoken agreement to let it disappear. She paused, taking a slow breath. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Jasmine let it linger in the room before continuing. "This isn't a mistake. It's not an oversight. This was a deliberate act, money intended for public good, used to line private pockets. And the system, your system, let it happen. But not today. Today, the truth comes out." She straightened up slightly, letting the weight of her final words rest on Green's shoulders. "The people deserve to know where their money is going. They deserve to know why someone in this room thought they could get away with this." Green's lips trembled, but no words came out. The room was deafening in its silence, the magnitude of what was unfolding weighing down on every person present. Jasmine's words were simple, but they had carved a truth so sharp, so clear, that no one could escape it, and the irony hung heavy. The very system meant to serve the people was the one that had protected the corruption she now exposed. With the sting of the real estate revelation still fresh, Jasmine pressed forward, her next move like a surgeon carefully peeling back yet another layer of corruption, this time tied directly to private flights funded by a shady source. Now, let's talk about the flights, Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the rising tension in the room. What I'm about to show you are flight logs, private jet flights paid for by an individual currently under federal investigation for wire fraud. She slid the next set of documents across the table, the weight of each page growing heavier as she spoke. The person funding these flights is Leonard March, the owner of Orbit Holdings, a company under IRS scrutiny for fraudulent international transactions. She didn't look at Green. She didn't need to. She could feel the eyes in the room shifting, sensing the gravity of the situation. Jasmine glanced at the flight logs, her gaze scanning the names and dates. These flights weren't ordinary commercial flights, she said, her voice firm. They were booked through Orbit Holdings, which is a private company. The trips were all to Scottsdale, Arizona, one of the most luxurious, exclusive locations in the country. She paused, letting the implication of her words sink in. And these flights, thousands of dollars each, were never disclosed on any campaign finance report. Not a single entry in Representative Green's public filings mentioned these flights. She shook her head, the disbelief clear in her tone. How can a sitting congresswoman have campaign funds funneled through private flights, paid for by a man under investigation for financial crimes, and not disclose it to the public? The room felt smaller, quieter. Even the aides at the back had stopped typing, their eyes locked on Jasmine. But this isn't where it ends, she continued, not giving Green a chance to defend herself. She flipped through the pages, revealing invoices for stays at a high-end resort in Scottsdale, Arizona. Once they arrived, they didn't stay at any ordinary hotel, Jasmine said, her voice dropping with the weight of the next revelation. They stayed at the Phoenician, one of the most expensive resorts in the area, a 3-night stay that cost $3,500, paid for by none other than Leonard March, the same man under investigation. She allowed the figures to settle in the room. The numbers were stark. And again, none of this was disclosed, not a single mention in Green's campaign filings. The question is simple: why not? Jasmine's gaze flicked over to the committee members, her eyes unwavering. How does a sitting congresswoman justify a stay at a luxury resort, paid for by a man under investigation for fraud, using campaign funds that should be accounted for? This isn't just oversight. This isn't a minor slip-up. This is corruption hiding behind loopholes in legal jargon. The silence that followed was oppressive, a heavy stillness as everyone processed the sheer magnitude of the situation. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She was speaking facts, hard, undeniable facts. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, and it was done with the expectation that no one would dig deeper, that no one would ask the hard questions. But today, those questions are being asked, and the answers are being forced into the light. Her words hung in the air like the threat of a storm that had only just begun to gather. As Jasmine's evidence continued to mount, Green's composure began to crumble. What had been a controlled, calculated facade started to shatter, and in its place, desperation and fury took over. Green's expression twisted, her face reddening with each word Jasmine spoke. She gripped the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. The heat of her anger was palpable, radiating from her in waves. She could no longer maintain the calm, collected image she had so carefully crafted. "This is ridiculous," Green shouted, her voice rising in pitch as she shot to her feet. "You're twisting the facts. This is all a lie." The committee members flinched at the outburst, but Jasmine didn't budge. She didn't even flinch. She simply continued, her voice unwavering, her presence like a storm that refused to be drowned out by the noise. Green's face was contorted with fury now, her hands waving in wild, erratic motions as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You have no proof. None of this is real." Her voice echoed off the walls, desperate and frantic. But Jasmine remained composed, almost as though the outburst was nothing more than a distant echo. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She was the calm in the center of the storm, and her next move was already decided. She turned to the pile of documents in front of her, flipping through them with the kind of confidence only the truth could provide. "As I've said before, Congresswoman, Jasmine said, her tone unwavering. I have records. I have proof. And I have the bank statements to show exactly where that money went. She held up the next page, her fingers deliberate as she displayed the flight receipts for all to see. The flights to Scottsdale, the luxurious resort stays, all paid for by Leonard March, a man under federal investigation for fraud. These weren't just personal indulgences. They were covered up using campaign funds, and that's illegal. She let the words sink into the room, watching as Green's face tightened with each new revelation. You can shout, you can deflect, Jasmine continued, her voice steady as a calm breeze. But the more you scream, the clearer it becomes that you have no answer for the facts I've presented. And the public is watching. They see the truth. They know that corruption isn't something that happens by accident. It's a pattern, a choice. Green's face twisted with rage, her hands trembling as she pointed furiously at Jasmine. You're lying, she spat. This is a witch hunt. You're trying to destroy me. But Jasmine didn't react to the outburst. She simply looked at Green, her eyes steady, like a steady hand holding the reins of a horse that was trying to run wild. I'm not here to destroy anyone, Congresswoman, Jasmine said, her voice measured. I'm here to make sure the truth gets heard. The people deserve to know what's been hidden from them. The room was silent now, an uneasy, heavy silence. Even Green seemed to realize the weight of Jasmine's words, the truth slowly sinking in like a tide that couldn't be held back. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence was already speaking louder than any words she could say. You can call it a smear. You can call it a political attack. But the truth remains. You used public funds for personal gain, Jasmine said, her words ringing in the room like the toll of a bell. And that's something you can't talk your way out of. For the first time, Green's eyes flickered. The fierce, unyielding stance she had maintained for so long began to crack, and in its place there was a flicker of uncertainty. Jasmine didn't let up. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Green's, and her voice remained steady, calm. You've built your career on loudness, on deflecting, on drowning out the truth. But now, Congresswoman, the truth is louder than you. In that moment, Green's face changed. The anger began to subside, replaced by something colder, fear. The kind of fear you feel when you realize the game is over and there's nowhere left to run. And Jasmine stood there calm and composed, the storm now subsiding, knowing she had done her job. The truth was out. The weight of Jasmine's previous revelations was still settling in the air when she shifted seamlessly to her next point, one that would directly connect Green's vote to hidden corporate ties and the secret meetings that had been carefully concealed. Jasmine didn't falter. She held Green's gaze, her voice sharp as a scalpel. This isn't just about campaign money, Congresswoman. This is about influence. Powerful, unchecked influence, she began, pausing just long enough to make sure every eye in the room was on her. When you voted against the Clean Water Accountability Act, a bill that would have safeguarded critical water resources in this country, you did so after meeting with a man whose company stands to profit massively from deregulation. Nicholas Averill, the CEO of Westbridge Energy, a company with ties deep in the oil and gas sector. She didn't wait for Green to respond, knowing the truth had already been laid bare. This meeting, as you know, took place just weeks before your vote, and yet you didn't disclose it. You didn't mention the ties you had with the very people who stood to gain from your vote. The room was heavy with the implications. Jasmine's voice never wavered as she continued, the next piece of evidence already in her hands. And here, I present something you can't dismiss. This photo, she said, holding up a photograph that now seemed to pulse with significance. This is a photo of you with Nicholas Averill, taken at a private resort in Sedona, Arizona. A photo that was posted publicly and then, almost immediately, removed, deleted. She let the image linger in the air, letting its significance sink in. The photo was clear, the two figures standing together on a sunlit terrace, both laughing, glasses of whiskey in hand. The casual nature of the photo, taken in such a private, personal moment, spoke volumes. Jasmine didn't need to make accusations. The image did the work for her. This wasn't a public meeting, Congresswoman. This was a private encounter with a man whose company stands to gain billions of dollars in deregulation, dollars that would have been made possible by your vote. And yet this photo was scrubbed from the internet, as if the meeting had never happened. Why? She allowed the silence to build, knowing the weight of the question was enough to send ripples through the room. Why was this meeting hidden from the public? Why wasn't it disclosed in your financial filings? Why delete the evidence of your connection to a man who stands to directly benefit from the policy you voted against? Her voice remained cold, unwavering. Because this wasn't just a vote, Congresswoman. This was a deal, a private arrangement, orchestrated behind closed doors. Jasmine didn't look away from Green as she spoke, watching as the reality of what she had just exposed began to sink in. The room was tense, the air thick with the implications. "This is the very definition of corruption," Jasmine said quietly, but with deadly clarity. A sitting congresswoman meeting in private with corporate executives who stand to profit from her vote, and then hiding that meeting from the public, hiding the truth, hiding the power behind your decisions. She let the final word hang in the air, her eyes still locked on Green, who had no defense, no words left to say. Jasmine wasn't done, but in this moment, it was clear there was nothing more Green could hide. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. As the air thickened with Green's furious outbursts, Jasmine remained unshaken, quietly turning the page of her file and preparing to dismantle the final wall of her opponent's defense. Green's outburst was almost primal, a raw burst of anger, her face red and eyes wild. "This is a witch hunt," she screamed, her hands slamming down onto the desk with force that rattled the table. "You're trying to ruin me with lies and false accusations. All of this is just to destroy me and my career." Her voice was shrill, each word full of panic and fear, as if she could drown out the facts with sheer volume. Her hands were trembling now, gripping the edge of the table in a desperate attempt to regain some control over her unraveling image. "This is all a smear campaign, and you know it." The room was caught in the tension, the committee members frozen, unsure how to react to the fury coming from the other side. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't let the noise disturb her focus. She didn't rush. She simply placed her hand on the next page of her file and turned it slowly, her fingers deliberate, her gaze never leaving Green's now visibly shaking form. "Congresswoman," Jasmine said, her voice calm, but it carried the weight of something far more dangerous than anger. "Truth. You may scream and shout, but that won't change what's on this page." She held up a new document, her eyes steady and unwavering as she continued. "What I have here is the business registration for Green Capital Group, a company you set up shortly after voting against critical real estate rental reforms. A company," she emphasized, "that you failed to disclose on your financial records and whose funding came directly from PAC donations. You voted against a bill that would have regulated rental prices in key areas. But what did you do instead? You opened a company that directly profits from the lack of regulation." She let the words land heavily in the room, watching Green's face twist in shock, her hands tightening into fists. Green's breathing became erratic. This is not what it looks like," she shot back, voice cracking. But there was less force behind the words now. Jasmine didn't wait for the defense, her focus unbroken. "No, Congresswoman, it's exactly what it looks like," Jasmine replied, turning the page again with deliberate calm. "You can deny it all you want, but the records are here. You founded Green Capital Group after voting against a bill that would have regulated real estate markets. And the payments made to this company? They came from your PAC funds, money that was supposed to serve your campaign, not line your pockets." Jasmine's voice dropped, now cutting through the air with a sharp edge. "These are not mistakes. These are deliberate actions, calculated to protect your financial interests at the expense of the public." The room was completely still now. Green's earlier defiance was draining away, replaced by a tense silence that spoke louder than any argument. Jasmine's steady gaze never wavered. She flipped to the next page, her hand firm as she set another damning document down in front of the committee. "Here's another record of the transfers made from your PAC to Green Capital Group. These weren't small payments, Congresswoman. They were significant sums, money transferred directly after your vote to block rental reform legislation. Her voice carried the weight of a clear conclusion. You used your position for personal gain. You used campaign funds to support a private venture that directly benefited from your vote. Green's face was pale now, the anger draining from her expression, replaced with something far more dangerous: vulnerability. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as if the words no longer made sense. You've been caught, Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering, and no amount of yelling will change that. The room felt smaller now, the silence becoming oppressive, as Green sat rigid, struggling to find any defense. Jasmine stood tall, the weight of her calm only making the truth more obvious. You can continue to scream about witch hunts and lies, but the truth is right here. It's undeniable, and it's on record. She paused, letting the words settle. The American people deserve more than this. They deserve honesty, integrity, and a representative who doesn't use their power for personal gain. For the first time, Green looked away, her lips tight and her hands folded in her lap, no longer clenched in defiance. Jasmine's eyes never left her as the room settled into an uneasy stillness. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it now. As the hearing came to a close, the room may have gone quiet, but outside the world had erupted. Every word Jasmine spoke, every piece of evidence she laid bare, began to take on a life of its own, spreading like wildfire across the digital landscape. The following hours were a blur of activity, each moment more intense than the last. By the time Jasmine stepped out of the Capitol building, the footage from the hearing was already everywhere. Clips of her calm, unflinching delivery were being shared and reshared on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, cut to perfection into 15-second snippets that captured not just the evidence, but the power of her words. The image of Marjorie Taylor Greene, visibly rattled, her face flushed with anger, quickly became the centerpiece of every post, meme, and news segment. It was as if the video had taken on a life of its own, no longer just footage from a congressional hearing, but a living, breathing symbol of the moment the truth was forced into the light. The hashtag #ReceiptStorm was now trending on platforms like Reddit, Telegram, and YouTube Shorts, where every new clip sent shockwaves through the online world. The mainstream media couldn't keep up with the pace. Every second, new comments flooded in. Ordinary citizens, analysts, and political enthusiasts began dissecting every detail Jasmine had presented, from the campaign finance records to the photos of Green with corporate executives. No one could deny the facts Jasmine had laid out. Her evidence didn't leave room for debate. It was airtight. The more they looked, the clearer it became that Marjorie Taylor Greene had been caught red-handed, and no amount of deflection could erase what had been revealed. Even conservative analysts, some of whom had initially defended Greene, found themselves struggling to explain away the damning revelations. One of Fox News' most respected veteran reporters, Harold Miles, didn't mince words when discussing the fallout. "I don't care who's right politically," he said in a live interview, his voice steady but resigned. "What I see here isn't a political attack. It's a data dissection, a surgical strike on corruption." Miles paused, looking directly at the camera, his gaze piercing. "And anyone trying to call this a witch hunt is ignoring the numbers. The data doesn't lie. You can't talk your way out of this one." His words rang out across cable networks, and it wasn't just Fox viewers who were hearing it. Miles' interview was shared by news outlets far and wide, reaching people who'd never followed politics before. As the public's awareness grew, so did the intensity of the conversation. Thousands of viewers tuned into the live-streamed hearings, and within minutes, comments began to pour in. Dozens of them, hundreds, then thousands. People who had never been involved in political discourse found themselves part of the conversation, commenting, debating, and sharing their own opinions on the evidence Jasmine had so clearly laid out. The live-stream chat was flooded with thoughts and analysis, but above all, a singular sentiment echoed through the virtual world: the feeling that something had finally been exposed. Ordinary people were watching a politician who had evaded accountability for years, finally being forced to face the consequences of her actions. The reaction wasn't confined to social media. Local talk radio stations across the country began discussing the revelations, with callers from every corner of the political spectrum expressing their disbelief. Many praised Jasmine's calm, methodical presentation of the facts, while others criticized Green's increasingly erratic behavior. For the first time, it seemed like the public wasn't buying the usual excuses or evasions. "She had to know this was coming," one caller said on a Tampa-based talk show. "You can't play these games for years and not get caught eventually. Jasmine did what she had to do, and now the whole country knows." The shift was palpable. An undeniable wave of support for Jasmine was surging through the nation, while Green's deflections were growing more desperate by the hour. Then the analysts got involved. Independent political figures, some from conservative backgrounds, who began tearing apart every claim Green had made. They combed through campaign finance records, connected the dots between her votes and private meetings, and uncovered further inconsistencies in her disclosures. One analyst pointed out how the luxury trips funded by corporate interests seemed to align perfectly with legislation that directly benefited those same corporations. "It's a pattern," the analyst said, his voice urgent, "and it's right there in the filings. The question isn't whether this is corruption, it's whether we, as a country, are willing to let this go unchecked." The digital world had become a battlefield, where every new bit of information was eagerly analyzed, every new question asked, and every new piece of evidence dissected under the harshest light. Twitter threads, Reddit posts, and YouTube videos broke down the finer details of Jasmine's presentation. Some even zoomed in on the expressions on Green's face, comparing her denial to the way her voice cracked when the truth was laid out. It wasn't just the facts anymore, it was the way they had been delivered. Jasmine's calm confidence in the face of Green's growing hysteria became the focal point of the entire narrative. People saw her as someone who refused to back down, someone who wasn't afraid to stand alone and hold the powerful accountable. But it wasn't just the political analysts or journalists who were noticing. Ordinary people, far removed from the halls of power, began taking to social media with their own takes on the situation. Farmers, teachers, doctors, and factory workers all chimed in, many expressing shock and disbelief that Green had been allowed to operate this way for so long. The online conversation grew louder, and soon it felt as though the entire country was talking about it. The divide between the public and the political elites had never seemed so wide, and it was clear that this moment, this revelation, had struck a nerve with the American people. They were tired of the corruption, tired of the lies, and tired of being ignored. Within hours of the hearing, even larger media outlets began weighing in. News channels were forced to address the story, and national anchors who had once shrugged off similar scandals now found themselves grappling with the scale of this one. What had been a local political skirmish was now a nationwide spectacle, and Jasmine was at the center of it. Her calm, steady presentation had cut through the noise, and now the story was hers to control. "She didn't raise her voice," one commentator said. "She didn't lash out. She just laid out the truth, and that's what the country is reacting to." By the time the evening news rolled around, the political fallout was undeniable. Major news outlets began to question how much longer Green could avoid serious scrutiny. The story had crossed party lines. Republican and Democrat alike were calling for accountability, and even some of Green's closest allies were starting to distance themselves. A quiet but powerful shift was taking place, and Jasmine was at the heart of it. In a diner in Ohio, two retired teachers sipped their coffee as they watched the coverage. One of them leaned forward and shook his head. "She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She just showed us the truth." The other nodded in agreement. "This is the kind of honesty we need." The clip of Jasmine presenting her evidence, calm, collected, unflinching, had become a symbol of hope for many people. For the first time in a long while, they saw someone stand up and do what they believed was right, without the need for theatrics or grandstanding. It was as if Jasmine had become a beacon for everyone who felt like they had no voice in a system rigged against them. The world outside the hearing room was reacting in a way no one could have predicted. Jasmine's calm confidence had broken through the noise, and now the fallout from her actions would reshape the way people viewed power and accountability. This wasn't just a story about a politician caught in a lie. It was a story about the people finally being heard, and about one woman who refused to let the truth be buried any longer. While the public's fury grew, the walls began to close in on Marjorie Taylor Greene. Behind closed doors, The real consequences of Jasmine's revelations were beginning to take shape. Marjorie Taylor Greene was no longer the dominant force she once was. In the hours following the hearing, she did what she always did. She fought. But this time, the battlefield was different. The fallout was immediate and relentless. Greene began to cancel every scheduled interview, even with friendly media outlets like OAN and Newsmax, where she'd previously found a comfortable platform. She knew her time on those channels had been a calculated game of control, but now the game was over. The interviews that once amplified her voice, that allowed her to speak freely, were no longer an option. She had to retreat into silence, into damage control. Even the usual loyalist networks weren't willing to shield her from the growing storm. But the media blackout was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, the power structure that had once rallied behind her was starting to crumble. A senior advisor who had long stood in her corner sent a private email that was later leaked to the press. "She doesn't need more publicity," the email read. "She needs a lawyer." The stark words echoed through Greene's inner circle, a quiet acknowledgement of the new reality. Her allies had begun to recognize that the situation was no longer just political. It was legal, and there was only so much public spin could do when the truth was out, laid bare for the entire country to see. The financial support, the lifeblood of any political campaign, began to evaporate. Three major donors, whose backing had been crucial to Greene's rise, quietly pulled out of her campaign. Their decision to withdraw was swift and deliberate. One of them, a well-known real estate magnate, posted a public statement on LinkedIn that was impossible to ignore. "We cannot, in good conscience, support actions that lack transparency and integrity. We do not condone shady dealings in any form." The words were a dagger, as much a public rebuke of Greene as they were an act of self-preservation. The tide had shifted, and Greene was no longer the trusted ally of the powerful figures who had once stood behind her. Inside the secretive confines of her campaign's war room, the cracks in her defense became even more evident. The tension in the room was suffocating as the few remaining advisors tried to salvage what they could. But Greene, whose ability to rage and deflect had carried her through many controversies, found herself at a loss. She threw a thick stack of campaign files onto the table, the papers scattering across the surface with a sharp slap. The sound reverberated through the room, punctuating the moment of realization. "They think I'm going to apologize?" Greene hissed, her voice low but venomous. Her words were laced with a cold fury, a mix of pride and desperation. "They'll have to drag me out of this seat with their claws first." Her face was a mask of defiance, but the vulnerability beneath it was undeniable. She had always believed that forceful words could bulldoze through any obstacle, but now she was realizing that the words, the lies, the manipulations, none of them would shield her from the truth. The walls had closed in. There was no escaping the reality of what had been exposed. Greene's hands clenched into fists, and for the first time in years, she wasn't in control. The bravado that had once defined her was faltering, slipping through her fingers like sand. Her advisors shifted nervously, avoiding eye contact, unsure how to move forward. Greene, usually so quick to dictate the narrative, now found herself trapped in a position where even her most loyal supporters had begun to distance themselves. She slammed her fist onto the table, her voice rising once more. "They think they can break me? I'll burn everything to the ground first." But no one spoke up. The silence in the room was deafening, because it wasn't just her own political career that was at risk anymore. It was her entire reputation, the foundation of everything she had built. For all her posturing, there was no escaping the reality that Jasmine had taken control of the narrative. Jasmine's calm, measured words had shattered Greene's image in the eyes of the public. The evidence was irrefutable, and Greene's world was now unraveling at an alarming pace. The political allies who had once supported her were now backing away. The financial lifelines that had sustained her campaign were severed. The foundation was crumbling, and no amount of shouting or deflection could hold it together. Greene's fierce, confrontational style, the very thing that had carried her this far, was now the source of her undoing. In her final moments of defiance, Greene tried to reclaim her authority, but it was clear to everyone in the room that she was no longer the one in control. The words she once used to silence her critics were no longer enough. Jasmine had exposed the cracks in her armor, and the world was watching as they deepened. For Green, the fight was far from over, but the rules had changed. 1 week had passed since the explosive revelations, and the dust had barely settled when Jasmine walked back into the House chamber. This time, with a purpose. The stage was set for something far more devastating. The morning air in the House of Representatives felt heavier than usual. A quiet buzz hummed through the chambers, as reporters and staffers exchanged whispers. It had been a week since Jasmine Crockett had laid out the first round of explosive revelations about Marjorie Taylor Greene's financial misdeeds. The media had chewed over the footage, dissecting every detail, but today, Jasmine had returned, and everyone in the room could feel that something even bigger was coming. When she entered the chamber, the atmosphere changed. She moved with purpose, her posture as solid as ever, and this time she carried something with her, a simple black folder. No fanfare, no dramatic pauses, just a quiet confidence that set the room on edge. She walked to the podium, her gaze scanning the room briefly, taking in the tension and anticipation. And then, with the calmest of voices, she began. "I've verified the authenticity," Jasmine said, her words ringing clear through the silent room. "And what I'm about to show you will make everything from last week seem like the warm-up act." The room tensed at her words. Everyone was already on edge after the previous week's revelations. The tension was palpable, but now it was more than just anticipation. It was fear. Fear of what Jasmine might be about to unleash. She opened the black folder slowly, methodically, as if savoring the moment. Inside there were several documents, but one in particular stood out. A memorandum from Barrow and Price, a well-known financial consulting firm. Jasmine didn't immediately speak. She let the documents sit on the podium for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch, the weight of the moment growing heavier with each passing second. "This memorandum," she began, her voice steady but sharp, "reveals a hidden deal between Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and a major lobby group, a deal made under the guise of environmental deregulation, one that involves not just shady dealings, but outright corruption." She glanced down at the page, her fingers tracing the words as she continued. "It's a consulting contract, one that Greene signed in exchange for support to amend critical environmental laws. The language in the contract is clear. Greene was offered influence over legislation in return for her political backing of deregulation measures that would benefit corporate interests." Jasmine's voice didn't waver. "This deal was signed under the radar, a private agreement between Greene and powerful lobbyists, all while she claimed to be advocating for the people. The hypocrisy is staggering." The members of the committee shifted in their seats, many of them leaning forward as Jasmine flipped to the next page. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. The audience was fully absorbed in what was unfolding, and reporters, sensing the change in the atmosphere, began jotting down notes, their pens moving faster. Jasmine was careful as she turned each page, allowing the room to digest each new revelation as it came. "And there's more," Jasmine said quietly, her voice cutting through the murmur of disbelief in the room. "The contract includes a detailed itinerary of private meetings between Greene and the lobbyists from Barrow and Price. Meetings that were not disclosed to the public and certainly not to the committee." Her eyes met the faces of the committee members one by one. These meetings were held in secret, behind closed doors. Greene was directly involved in discussions about amending environmental laws that would have benefited the very corporations behind the lobbying efforts. And to ensure the deal stayed under wraps, the parties involved took measures to hide their tracks, measures that were conveniently omitted from public disclosures. As Jasmine laid the documents before the committee, she could feel the weight of her words sinking in. Greene was no longer just a politician in the crosshairs of an investigation. She was a person caught in a web of deceit, one that Jasmine was carefully unspooling, thread by thread. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room, but Greene wasn't about to go quietly. As Jasmine continued to speak, Greene's face darkened, her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth seemed to grind together. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, she shot out of her seat, her voice rising in a mixture of frustration and denial. "This is absurd," she snapped. "This is a political attack, plain and simple. You've got no proof. This is just a witch hunt." Her voice echoed in the chamber, desperate and defensive. But Jasmine remained unmoved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't allow the confrontation to shake her. Instead, she calmly reached for the next document in the folder, flipping it open. "You're mistaken, Congresswoman," Jasmine said quietly, her eyes never leaving Green. "The proof is right here." She held up a signed document. Green's signature at the bottom, clear as day. The room fell silent again. "This," Jasmine said, pointing to the signature, "is the final piece. A signature confirming that Marjorie Taylor Greene knowingly signed off on this agreement with Barrow and Price, the very company that helped push through the deregulation measures she championed." A Republican member of the committee, his voice tinged with disbelief, spoke up. "Are you sure this is the original signature, Representative Crockett? Is this truly hers?" Jasmine looked at him with the same calm resolve she had displayed throughout the hearing. "I have expert verification," she replied, "and I also have a video of the signing." The room went deathly still. The committee members exchanged uncertain glances, and for the first time, Green's face turned pale. The defiance in her eyes began to flicker, replaced by something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk tightly, her fingers white-knuckled. Jasmine let the silence linger, giving Green no chance to recover, no room to fight back with deflection. The moment was too big, too overwhelming. Green had no defense, nothing she could say that could undo the destruction of her credibility. The truth was laid out, and Jasmine had done her job. She had exposed it. Jasmine didn't rush. She stood tall, letting the weight of her words fill the room. This was the moment of reckoning, the point of no return. She had made her case. The truth had been revealed, and it wasn't going away. As Jasmine's revelations continued to reverberate across the political landscape, the fallout reached far beyond the confines of the Capitol, echoing through small towns, local communities, and social media platforms where the public's trust was unraveling piece by piece. A week after the hearing, the true scale of the scandal began to unfold. It wasn't just about political games or insider dealings anymore. It was about betrayal, a word that had become painfully familiar to many. In a small town in Kentucky, a 62-year-old man, once a staunch supporter of Marjorie Taylor Greene, sat in front of his microphone on a local podcast, his voice heavy with disillusionment. "I supported her because I believed in her integrity," he said, his words filled with a raw, quiet anger. "I thought she was different. I thought she was someone who stood for something real." He paused, the weight of his own words sinking in. "But now, after everything that's come out, everything Jasmine Crockett exposed, I feel like I've been betrayed. And I'm not the only one." This was no longer just a political scandal. It was personal. Green's supporters, the ones who had trusted her the most, were now questioning their loyalty. Across the country, people who had once seen her as a fighter for the people were now grappling with the painful realization that they had been misled. The trust they had placed in her had been shattered, and in its place was a deep sense of betrayal. In Georgia, the ripple effect continued. At a local church, a preacher stood before his congregation, his voice steady but filled with solemn conviction. "We cannot call ourselves patriots if we are not honest with the people we represent," he declared, his words resonating deeply with the men and women in the pews. "Lying to the American people, betraying their trust, doesn't make us patriots. It makes us hypocrites." The room was silent, the weight of his statement hanging in the air like a thick fog. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about integrity. It was about the promise of transparency and truth that Greene had built her career on. And now that promise had been broken. As the week wore on, the effects of Jasmine's revelations reached the younger generation. On TikTok, a new trend began to take over: the receipt challenge. In videos filmed in bedrooms and living rooms across the country, young people began mimicking Jasmine's calm, methodical approach. They'd hold up mock documents, flipping through pages just like she had, before looking directly into the camera and saying, "Let's talk about it." The trend quickly went viral, with thousands of videos flooding the platform, many mocking Greene's fall from grace. It wasn't just about following a trend, it was about demanding accountability, something that seemed to have been lost in the world of politics. The buzz on social media was undeniable. People from all walks of life, from all political affiliations, were watching, sharing, and commenting. The number receipt challenge wasn't just a fun trend. It was a statement, a call for transparency, a demand for truth in a political climate that had long been marred by lies and deceit. The viral videos became a symbol of the younger generation's frustration with the system and their collective desire to hold those in power accountable. The message was clear. The truth had been exposed, and it couldn't be ignored any longer. Meanwhile, the numbers were speaking for themselves. A new poll showed a dramatic shift in public opinion, especially within Green's own base. Her approval rating had plummeted by 17 percentage points in just 5 days, a staggering decline that included even her most loyal supporters. Once untouchable, Green was now a politician in freefall, losing ground not only among moderates and independents, but even among her staunchest allies. The shift was undeniable. The foundation of her political empire had cracked wide open, and there was no telling how far it would crumble. The internal fracture lines were now visible. Donors who had once poured money into her campaign were now pulling back, their support waning in the face of mounting evidence. Party members who had once been vocal defenders were now distancing themselves, carefully avoiding the topic in public. Even the media, once content to follow her every word, began to ask tougher questions. Green had always prided herself on being the voice of the disillusioned, on representing the forgotten, the ignored. But now that same voice was being drowned out by the very people she claimed to speak for. The truth, as Jasmine had made clear, was no longer something she could escape. It wasn't just the political elite who had turned on her. The everyday citizens, the people who had once stood behind her with unwavering loyalty, were now finding themselves questioning everything they had believed in. They had trusted her. They had believed in her fight. And now that trust was being replaced by something darker: disillusionment. The very foundation of her political career had been built on a promise of honesty and integrity, and now that foundation was crumbling under the weight of the truth. Jasmine's words had ignited something in the public, a shift in perception that could not be undone. The political machines that had once propelled Green forward were now working against her. The stories of betrayal and corruption that Jasmine had exposed were no longer confined to the walls of the hearing room. They were everywhere, on social media, in the press, in homes across the country. The fight was no longer just political, it was personal. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was beginning to realize that no amount of deflection or loud, angry rhetoric could bury the truth any longer. Jasmine had done more than just present the facts. She had sparked a movement, and as Green's world continued to unravel, there was no telling where the fallout would end. But one thing was certain: the truth had found its way into the light, and there was no going back. A week had passed since Jasmine's explosive revelations, and while the public uproar continued to grow, inside the halls of Congress, the quieter, more dangerous aftermath was unfolding. The first sign that things were changing came not with a press conference or a loud announcement, but with a simple memo. The House Ethics Committee had officially opened a preliminary investigation into Marjorie Taylor Greene. No fanfare, no grandstanding, just a quiet notification that each member was required to review the evidence laid out by Representative Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't a headline grabber, but it was the beginning of something much more significant. The truth was finally catching up with Greene, and the committee had no choice but to act. The message was clear. The stakes were much higher now. The media, which had once hung on every word Greene spoke, now found themselves scrambling to find a narrative to defend her. But the truth was irrefutable, and the support from her Republican allies was starting to fray. Several party members who had once rallied behind Greene began to avoid the cameras, offering no public defense when asked about the unfolding scandal. The silence spoke volumes. These were the same voices that had once called her a fighter for the people. But now they were silent, unsure how to spin the growing mountain of evidence. There was no longer any room for deflection. In the privacy of her office, Greene sat with her head in her hands, staring at the stack of documents that had brought her to this point. The lawyer who had been with her through countless controversies entered the room quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. She didn't need to ask what was coming. Her voice cracked as she looked up at him, asking, "How much of a chance do I have?" Her lawyer, who had always been the calm presence amidst the chaos, took a long pause. When he finally spoke, it wasn't what Green wanted to hear. "With the level of documentation Crockett has presented, you're lucky if you only lose your seat. If you're unlucky," he trailed off, his silence louder than the words that had yet to come. The reality of it all, what had once been a political battle she thought she could navigate with force and deflection, was now something else entirely. This was about more than just votes. It was about integrity, and the cracks in her facade were beginning to show. She leaned back in her chair, unable to escape the truth of his words. The power she had relied on, the shouting, the deflections, were no longer enough. She had made a dangerous gamble with her career, and now, as the investigation unfolded, she saw the inevitable truth. She might not make it out of this. For the first time, Green felt the tight grip of reality. The investigation wasn't just a political inconvenience, it was a reckoning. In the following days, the political temperature rose, but Green was retreating. Her supporters were fewer and fewer, and those who had once stood by her now found themselves questioning the cost of loyalty. In the silence of her office, Green had become just another politician, facing the consequences of her actions, with nowhere to run and no one left to defend her. The walls were closing in, and for once, Green had no words left to say. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a nationally televised hearing watched by millions, Jasmine Crockett confronts former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin over her sudden resignation, just weeks before lucrative media deals surfaced. Tension erupts in the chamber as Crockett unveils devastating evidence. Communities destabilized, key programs gutted, and a state left reeling in her absence. With emotions surging and the cameras locked in, Palin fights to defend her legacy, until one leaked memo threatens to unravel it all. The room freezes in silence. Was Palin running from a reckoning, or cashing in on the chaos she left behind? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber of the U.S. Capitol was tense, every breath in sync with the red blink of live broadcast cameras. Over 9 million Americans were tuned in, expecting reflection, not confrontation. The hearing was billed as a forum on ethical responsibility in executive leadership, but the air already smelled of something more volatile. Sarah Palin, once governor of Alaska and now a polished symbol of conservative defiance, entered like a performer returning to her stage. She smiled confidently, posed briefly for cameras, and took her seat under the seal of the United States. Committee members murmured greetings, some deferential, others wary. Her testimony was meant to be inspirational, a tale of leadership under fire. She adjusted the mic, hands steady, and began. Her words, "I stepped down to protect Alaska from distraction, from dysfunction," sounded rehearsed, almost mythic. But across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, silent, eyes narrowed behind a thin wall of documents. She hadn't touched her pen. She hadn't smiled. While others applauded experience, she studied patterns. And beneath her calm was a storm. The truth wasn't just in her folders. It was in the unasked questions Palin thought she'd never have to face again. No one in the room, no one on air, knew what was coming. But Jasmine did. And she wasn't here to reminisce. She was here to reveal. And just as the floor opened, the atmosphere constricted, not with noise, but with the weight of performance. It was no longer a hearing, it was theater. And the star, as the cameras panned and the lights fell gently on the polished wood, was Sarah Palin, walking the aisle like a returning legend, summoned to rewrite her legacy. The right-wing media had primed the moment for days. "A warrior who shattered the establishment," one columnist declared. "The Alaskan Joan of Arc," said another. Even before she spoke, the script was written. She wasn't just a former governor. She was a symbol, a survivor, a saint. The audience wasn't just watching, they were participating in a carefully staged resurrection. She moved with the confidence of someone who had memorized every frame of her myth, hair set, smile exact, posture deliberate. As she reached the witness chair, she paused, a split-second glance to the gallery, the kind only a media-trained instinct can execute. Then sat, adjusted her blazer, and leaned into the microphone. I stepped down not out of fear, she began, voice smooth, rehearsed, but out of duty. When leadership becomes a lightning rod, you don't cling to power, you protect the people you serve, even if it costs you everything. Then she added, letting the line land like scripture. I resign because I place the needs of my state above the needs of my own reputation. She blinked slowly, let the words hang like a prayer at a funeral. There was no tremble, no hesitation. Just narrative, tight and invulnerable. A few members clapped, uncertainly at first, then louder. One staffer even stood halfway, glancing around for approval. But across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. No applause, no expression. Just two fingers holding the edge of a folder that hadn't left her grasp since the hearing began. Her eyes didn't track Palin's hands or her smile. They were locked on the gray and white printout tucked in front of her, a document with signatures, timestamps, and metadata that told a very different story. One that had no cameras. One that was never meant to see daylight. In that moment, the room was split, between those captivated by the show and one woman who had come prepared to dismantle it. But beneath the applause and the mythic glow of Palin's statement, something in the air turned, not dramatically, but unmistakably. It was the kind of shift only a few could sense, a drop in temperature, a hush behind the breathless cameras. And in that hush, Jasmine Crockett moved, not suddenly, not theatrically, just a small tap on her console. The chamber's giant digital display, until now dim, burst to life in a cold, clinical blue. A graph appeared, line by line, point by point, tracing Alaska's unemployment rate across 8 quarters. The timeline pulsed, before Palin's resignation and after, and then it spiked, increased 12%, not a suggestion, not an opinion, a documented rupture too sharp to ignore. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. Her gaze stayed locked on Palin. Let's not romanticize leadership, she said, her voice calm, sharp like polished steel. Let's examine the impact of absence. She gestured once, and the next slide snapped into place. A detailed state financial map unfolded. $1.2 billion in suspended or eliminated programs, color-coded by region. Yellow meant delayed, red meant canceled. Healthcare in Bethel, gone. A bridge project in Matanuska-Susitna, abandoned. Education funding for native schools, stripped clean. Jasmine let the silence thicken as the room absorbed what they were seeing. Data over drama, fallout over fiction. These aren't just numbers, Governor, she said, voice low and deliberate. These are broken grants, shuttered clinics, and phone calls no one returned. Then came the strike, swift, precise, impossible to dodge. Do you believe that walking away mid-crisis, without warning, without transition, was responsible governance? No one breathed. The screen kept glowing. The myth had been told. Now came the reckoning. The silence following Jasmine's question hung heavy, like a dropped curtain before an unscripted scene. And in that pause, when all eyes turned to the witness chair and breath seemed suspended between expectation and deflection, Sarah Palin inhaled slowly, visibly steadying herself, as if preparing to bleed onto the microphone. No numbers this time. No graphs. No talking points. What came next was personal, a pivot from policy to pain. Her voice emerged low and strained, carrying the weight of something rehearsed but real. No one tells you, she said, scanning the faces before her, what it costs to lead when your every move is targeted, not because you failed, but because you threatened the wrong people. Her gaze swept across the panel, not accusing, but imploring. I didn't step down because I was weak. I stepped down because I was being broken, systematically. Her hands clenched together on the desk, knuckles whitening. In the final year of my governorship, I faced 24 ethics complaints. 24. And not one of them led to a conviction. Not one. She paused. But they cost me over $500,000 in legal fees. That's more than I ever earned in office. The room didn't move. The camera zoomed in, tight, intrusive, unforgiving. Her eyes welled, and this time she didn't try to stop it. There were days I couldn't pay my lawyers and still afford groceries, she continued, her voice cracking. My husband was working overtime on the slope, and we were still drowning, all because I dared to challenge entrenched systems, to take on my own party when I saw corruption. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned slightly, not away from the room, but into herself, into the memory she was reliving in front of the nation. She reached for a tissue, hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the flood of exhaustion she no longer had the will to hide. I had 3 children at home. Trig was still a baby. Every morning I had to look them in the eye and pretend everything was okay, that their mother wasn't under siege, that we weren't selling furniture to stay afloat, that I wasn't reading court filings before bedtime stories. Her voice dropped lower, nearly a whisper but still audible to every corner of the chamber. No one came to help. No one stepped in. They just watched. Her next words came slower, as if extracted from somewhere deeper than memory, from guilt, perhaps, or pride in conflict with shame. Resigning wasn't abandonment. It was survival. It was the only way I could protect the people I loved. Another tear rolled down her cheek, tracing a path over powdered skin and falling soundlessly to the table below. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I was being dismantled, one allegation at a time, one headline at a time, until all that was left of me was a shell fighting ghosts I couldn't afford to exercise. She looked up now, locking eyes with no one and everyone. Her voice steadied again, but only just. If I hadn't resigned, I wouldn't just have lost my title. I would have lost my children, my home, my sanity. That's not politics. That's real life. That's what it cost me to lead. For a moment, just a moment, the chamber softened. Her vulnerability carved a silence more profound than any argument. The audience didn't clap, didn't shift. They simply stared, caught between empathy and disbelief, between the woman who once governed a state and the woman now testifying not as a politician, but as a mother under siege. But beyond the tissue, beyond the tear, and beyond the trembling lip, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not out of cruelty, not out of disbelief, but because she too had seen women like Palin cry on command in documents that told stories their tears never could. And Jasmine knew something the audience didn't yet. Vulnerability without truth is still performance. But for now, Palin had the floor, and her pain filled it. But just as sympathy began to thicken like smoke around Sarah Palin's voice, as the image of a struggling mother began to cement itself in the minds of viewers across the country, Jasmine Crockett struck a match and set the illusion ablaze. No raised voice, no grand gesture, just a single deliberate motion, her index finger tapping the panel beside her. And instantly, the room's massive screen came to life again. Not with charts or unemployment data this time, but with something far more intimate and damning. A contract. The header crisp and unmistakable. HarperCollins Publishers, LLC, exclusive book agreement with Sarah Louise Palin. In the fine print, the number blazed like a flare in a dark tunnel. $7 million advance, payable in 3 installments. The date was impossible to ignore. August 26, 2009. Just 2 months and 2 days after Palin's resignation letter had been delivered to the citizens of Alaska under the banner of sacrifice. The screen shifted again. Another document appeared, this time branded with the golden crest of Discovery Communications. At the top, a production agreement, Sarah Palin's Alaska, TLC television series. And beneath that, in bold, talent fee, $1,250,000 US. Attached to the agreement were schedules, filming locations, and a clause ensuring Palin retained creative control over the project's tone and message. In the background, the still image of Palin fly fishing in crystal-clear Alaskan rivers faded in. Pulled directly from early promotional footage. It wasn't leadership. It wasn't policy, it was marketing. And it was lucrative. Jasmine finally spoke. She didn't look up at the witness stand, not yet. Her eyes remained on the screen as if daring the numbers to refute her. $7 million, she began, her voice low, unwavering. That's the advance you received for your book, a memoir you were already negotiating while you were still in office. She turned the page on her desk, as calm as a surgeon. And here, a contract for a reality television series, signed less than 3 months after your resignation. Filmed not in silence, but with full studio crews. Executive produced by you. Marketed with your name, featuring your brand. Then finally she looked up, directly at Palin. Her tone hardened. You stood in this chamber and cried over legal bills. You told the American people you left office to save your family from financial ruin. But these aren't the papers of someone escaping hardship. These are the blueprints of someone capitalizing on celebrity. Palin didn't speak. Her lips parted, then froze. The crowd behind her sat frozen, as if the oxygen had been yanked out of the room. Somewhere near the press pool, a pen dropped and clicked across the floor. It was the only sound. Jasmine leaned back slightly, but her eyes didn't move. This wasn't retreat, she said, each word deliberate. This was a launch. Her hand hovered briefly above the last slide, now illuminated behind her. A bar chart showing Palin's total income in the 12 months after her resignation. $12.4 million from book deals, television appearances, and speaking engagements. You didn't step away from politics because you were drowning. You stepped away because it was more profitable to stand on dry land, holding a camera. She waited. The silence after was not a pause. It was a consequence. A moment left raw and untouched. The way only uncomfortable truth can hollow out a room. And then Jasmine delivered the line that shattered what was left of the image Palin had built over the past 30 minutes. You didn't resign because you were poor. You resigned to become a millionaire on TV. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The words were louder than any accusation, colder than any statistic. They didn't need a reaction. They were the reaction. In that moment, the narrative shifted, not just in the chamber, but across every home, office, and an airport bar tuned into the broadcast. And as the screen behind Jasmine dimmed to black, it no longer cast light on Palin. It cast shadow. The final syllable of Jasmine Crockett's sentence still hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving, when the spell of silence was broken, not by applause, not by rebuttal, but by intervention. A Republican senator seated 3 chairs from the center leaned forward abruptly, as if jolted by instinct rather than strategy. His voice, though measured, trembled faintly with indignation. "Madam Chair," he called out, his eyes darting toward Jasmine before settling on the dais. "With all due respect, I must object. Congresswoman Crockett is crossing a line. This chamber demands a degree of decorum. That was not a question. That was a personal insult. I ask that she show proper respect to our guest. Governor Palin deserves that much." The words landed with the brittle formality of someone reaching for control in a room already overtaken by truth. The tension didn't ease. It coiled tighter, as if the air itself refused to move forward until justice had finished speaking. Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She didn't even raise her voice. Her stillness was louder than any rebuttal. Her silence, deliberate and precise, served as its own indictment of systems that protect reputations over facts, appearances over impact. Before she could speak, the chairwoman raised one hand, palm down, and issued her ruling in a voice that silenced every whisper in the chamber. "Congresswoman Crockett will continue," she said firmly. "This is an oversight hearing, and oversight is meaningless without accountability." The ruling echoed through the hall like the toll of a bell. Final, unshakable. There would be no rescue. Not today, not here. The camera crew, sensing the pivot, shifted lenses with cinematic instinct. The primary broadcast feed cut sharply to a close-up of Sarah Palin's face, and for the first time since the hearing began, the veneer showed strain. Her lips, once steady and pressed into confident lines, now pulled tight across her teeth. Her eyes flickered, not with outrage, but with something far more revealing, doubt. Her jaw tensed, a muscle twitch betraying the effort to hold composure. She blinked twice, fast, deliberate, stalling. The kind of blink a person makes when recalibrating a strategy mid-collapse. The tears from earlier had dried, but in their place was something colder, rawer. The realization that the story she came here to tell had met a sharper, harder version of the truth. She tried to keep her posture, but the screen behind her had already done its work. The memory of those contracts, those dollar signs, the timeline, it all lingered behind her, like a ghost she couldn't outrun. No one spoke. No one moved. Every angle of her discomfort was caught in high definition, broadcast into living rooms and offices across the country. And as the camera held that frame, tight on the woman once called unstoppable, America saw not collapse, but erosion. Not explosion, but slow, irreversible unraveling. And just as the weight of Jasmine Crockett's last line still echoed across the chamber, a new kind of silence settled. Not awkward, not empty, but dense with anticipation. The kind of stillness that warns something far more damning is coming. The atmosphere, already tense, narrowed into razor focus as Crockett moved with lethal precision, tapping a key on her console. The overhead display blinked once, then illuminated with something that didn't resemble policy or opinion, but evidence, stained with the fingerprints of suppressed truth. The screen displayed a scanned document, worn at the corners, time-stamped, bearing the embossed seal of the Office of the Alaska State Attorney, dated April 7th, 2009. The bold black heading read, Confidential, Legal Counsel Memorandum, and beneath it, a subject line that sucked the breath from the room before a word was even read. Potential early exit of Governor Sarah Palin. Legal assessment and emergency considerations. Crockett stood slowly. Her movement wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, like a verdict rising to meet its silence. What you're looking at, she said, each syllable crisp and measured, is not a theory, not a partisan blog post, not a media rumor. Her voice cut through the stillness like a scalpel. This is a confidential legal memo drafted by senior attorneys in the state of Alaska, marked for internal review only, never meant to be seen by the public, and certainly never meant to surface here. She didn't look at Palin, not yet. The camera panned to the screen as Crockett read aloud, letting the words echo like charges in a courtroom. Governor Palin is believed to be actively exploring legal avenues for early resignation. Based on corroborated communication patterns and recent inquiries made by her private legal team, there is reasonable basis to conclude the governor is seeking to vacate her office prior to the conclusion of term, without triggering formal impeachment proceedings. The phrase "without triggering formal impeachment" hit like the drop of a gavel. The words weren't speculative, they weren't emotional, they were clinical, prepared by lawyers who'd seen something real and urgent behind the curtain. Palin didn't move, but the tightness in her jaw returned. The light from the screen cast a sterile glow against her cheekbones, and for a fleeting second, she looked less like a leader under fire and more like someone cornered by her own unfinished sentences. Jasmine turned the page on her folder and gestured slightly, prompting the screen to advance. Now, red highlights dominated the screen. A block of text, clearly meant for internal eyes only, was underlined and annotated. Jasmine read slowly. Given the compounding volume of ethics complaints filed against the governor, currently 19 pending and 5 in pre-investigative review, it is our legal opinion that at least 3 of these filings hold material substance that, if substantiated, could escalate to the level of an impeachment inquiry by the Alaska State Legislature. She paused just long enough for the words to settle like sediment in water. Then calmly she read the most chilling line of all. Recommendation: prepare contingency protocol in the event of an unannounced resignation. There it was. Stark. Undeniable. A legal body had already begun planning for her escape. Not as a noble act, but as a preemptive strike against accountability. Crockett let the weight of that sentence hover over the room like a thundercloud refusing to break. Let me be absolutely clear, Jasmine said, now turning her full focus to Palin for the first time since the document appeared. This memo was drafted before your resignation, weeks before you told the people of Alaska that you were protecting them from distractions, before you stood at a podium and claimed financial hardship, before the cameras, before the book deals, before the show. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. It had authority. It had truth. This wasn't sacrifice, this was strategy. Palin blinked once, slowly, deliberately, but said nothing. Her hands, which had moments earlier been clasped tightly on the table, now shifted minutely, fingers restless. She stared forward, expression caught between disbelief and calculation, as though re-evaluating a chessboard that no longer followed the rules she understood. The room had frozen around her. No one interrupted. Even her defenders sat in motionless silence, their talking points rendered useless in the face of a document no one had expected to see. The memo was not an interpretation. It was an internal admission, and now it was public. Jasmine took a slow breath, letting her next words come like a final blow. While the public was fed a story of resilience and martyrdom, your own state's legal counsel was preparing for political collapse. Her hand hovered over the screen's final page, where the document concluded with procedural steps for gubernatorial transition, including staff downsizing and crisis communication strategies. Proof that the machinery of exit had already been set in motion, long before Palin ever said a word to the people who elected her. "You didn't walk away from the job," Jasmine said, her voice like stone under pressure. "You planned your exit like a CEO facing indictment and hoped no one would ever see the blueprint." For a few seconds, the room became a vacuum. The lights, the wood panels, the marble pillars, all of it faded behind the thunderous silence that truth always leaves in its wake. The cameras stayed fixed on Palin. Her eyes didn't blink this time. Her mouth twitched slightly, the corners drawn just enough to betray the moment before the mask falls apart. And Jasmine sat back down, slowly, deliberately, as if knowing that there was nothing left to add. The document had already spoken, and its voice was the one thing Palin couldn't rewrite. The final echoes of the internal memo still lingered like smoke in the chamber. Its final line: "Prepare contingency protocol in the event of an unannounced resignation," humming beneath the surface like a distant alarm. The tension in the room wasn't just ambient now, it was personal. A soft shift in posture, a clenched jaw, a muscle twitch. Signs of a political mass beginning to fracture under pressure. And it was then, in the shadow of that silence, that Sarah Palin chose to speak. She sat up straighter, stiffening her spine as though defiance alone could armor her against what had just been exposed. Her voice, when it came, was brittle but composed, a tone familiar to those who'd seen leaders try to reassert control when the ground was already giving way beneath them. "That memo," she began, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, "was never officially acknowledged. It was staff chatter, internal speculation. That's not fact, that's fiction dressed up in a letterhead." She paused, glancing at the panel, her tone growing sharper. "Let's be clear. I have never been impeached. I've never even been formally investigated. That word, impeachment, never touched my name in any official capacity." Her voice tightened as she delivered what she clearly thought would be the killing stroke. "That was a rumor. I was never under threat of impeachment." A murmur stirred faintly from the gallery, not loud but perceptible, the kind of sound that fills a room when truth and spin collide, and no one's sure who will survive the impact. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She didn't blink. She let the defense sit there, untouched, just long enough to ferment in its own false confidence. Then, with a slow inhale and voice sharp as frost, she replied, not with fire but with devastating restraint, "No one said you were impeached, Governor." She leaned slightly forward, hands still calm atop the folder that had slowly peeled back the layers of Palin's narrative. "We said the legal counsel for your state believed, based on internal communications, third-party briefings, and your own movements, that if those complaints advanced, they would have had no choice but to prepare for it." Another pause. Intentional, surgical. "We said they were preparing for the fallout of a resignation that wasn't noble, but necessary." Palin's face froze. Not the practiced stillness of political theater, but the rigid pause of someone realizing they've miscalculated the battlefield. The defense she had prepared was aimed at an accusation no one had made, but Jasmine wasn't accusing her of being impeached. Jasmine was accusing her of something far worse, evading justice before it had the chance to knock. "And that," Jasmine added quietly, almost like an afterthought, "isn't gossip." That's governance, terrified of where the facts were leading. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need another document, because the courtroom wasn't in the pages anymore. It was in the silence that followed. And in that silence, Palin's narrative, built over a decade of memoirs, interviews, and image control, began to unravel at the seams. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet, tearing sound that only truth can make. The reverberations of Jasmine's last blow, terrified of where the facts were leading, still lingered in the chamber air like static. But before anyone could recover, a new name was called, and the silence hardened into stillness. It was the kind of quiet not born of respect, but of dread, the sound of a room bracing for revelation. "All rise for witness, Michael Wexler," the chairwoman announced. The name carried weight, not with the public perhaps, but with everyone who knew the machinery of Alaska's executive office. Wexler had served as a senior legal advisor inside Palin's administration during the volatile final year of her term. A man who never courted the cameras, a man who didn't leak, but also a man who, by his mere appearance, signaled that something buried deep was about to be unearthed. He walked slowly to the witness seat, his face unreadable, the lines of age and conflict etched deep along his brow. He wore a plain gray suit, no pin, no flourish, just the appearance of someone who had kept secrets for long enough. As he raised his right hand to be sworn in, even the cameras held back. This wasn't spectacle anymore. This was a reckoning. He sat, adjusted the mic with practiced caution, then spoke with a voice that was neither loud nor theatrical, but hauntingly precise. "During the final quarter of Governor Palin's administration," Wexler began, "I was tasked with reviewing and facilitating a number of private legal requests filed by senior members of the governor's staff." He looked up briefly, meeting no one's eyes. "Among those requests were two confidential outreach efforts, one to a Los Angeles-based firm that specialized in entertainment law, particularly reality television development, the other to a New York firm that negotiated large-scale nonfiction publishing deals." There was no gasp, no outcry, just a collective, breathless pause, as if the entire room understood the meaning before the witness had even finished. "These consultations," he continued, his voice tightening slightly, "were initiated several weeks before Governor Palin made any formal announcement, even before she scheduled the press conference." He reached into the folder before him and tapped a dated summary. In both cases, the objective was clear: to evaluate the scope and structure of potential media opportunities, specifically a televised docuseries and a memoir with national release projection, pending her resignation. The chamber froze. No one needed a follow-up. The implication wasn't subtle, it was surgical. The governor had been planning her exit not as a retreat from political persecution, but as a calculated pivot to personal profit. Jasmine hadn't simply poked holes in Palin's story. Wexler had just ripped out the foundation and held it up to the light. He sat still, unmoved by the tension folding in around him. At no point were these communications made public. At no point were they disclosed to the legislature, the media, or the citizens of Alaska. He cleared his throat once, softly like brushing dust off a buried file. They were handled through private counsel and routed through unofficial email channels. As far as I know, no minutes exist documenting those discussions in the official state archive. The room didn't breathe. Neither did Palin. Her hands, once neatly folded, now clenched visibly in her lap. Her jaw, which had moved easily when deflecting earlier questions, sat locked, a fortress suddenly without walls. And in that moment, the portrait she had painted, a mother besieged, a leader broken by injustice, fractured at its center. Because now, from the mouth of one of her own, the truth had emerged. She didn't fall. She prepared her landing. And while the chamber held its breath in silence, the outside world exploded. What began as a hearing tucked into the midday schedule of C-SPAN quickly mutated into a national rupture. By the time Michael Wexler stepped down from the witness seat, Chashur Palin resignation, truth had already surged past 2 million tweets in under an hour. The hashtag wasn't just trending, it was dominating, eating the top 5 spots on every U.S. platform. Phones buzzed in congressional staffers' pockets like alarms they couldn't silence. Commentators, influencers, political strategists, left, right, and everything in between, took to their feeds like emergency responders racing to a five-alarm fire. But this wasn't policy. This wasn't punditry. This was blood in the water. One viral clip led the digital wave, a tight shot of Jasmine Crockett's calm, unsparing delivery. You didn't fall. You prepared your landing. Paired with the screen behind her glowing with Palin's publishing contract and the internal state memo, it spread like a confession captured on hidden tape. Millions of viewers hit retweet without even watching the rest of the footage. They didn't need to. The image was enough. One woman standing, another unraveling, and the illusion of political martyrdom coming apart at the seams. Cable news networks scrambled. CNN broke into a scheduled interview with a Fortune 500 CEO mid-sentence, replacing his talking points with a live feed from the hearing. MSNBC dropped its economic panel on inflation within seconds of Wexler's testimony. Even Fox News, usually cautious to defend one of the GOP's original populist icons, began framing the coverage in language laced with distance, new scrutiny, unconfirmed revelations, narratives in collapse. But language wasn't needed. The video clips did the work. The image of Sarah Palin stiff in her chair, blinking into silence as documents surfaced against her, spoke with a clarity no anchor could match. Within 30 minutes, ABC, CBS, and NBC all cut into afternoon programming, bouncing soaps and courtroom dramas for the one real courtroom that now had America hooked. Even syndicated talk shows, pre-recorded, pre-scheduled, were pushed aside. One Chiron on CBS read in all caps, "Hearing or History." Beneath it, a live feed of Jasmine flipping through a folder as if she were turning the pages of a country's political memory. In coffee shops across the country, people huddled over phones and tablets. In airports, gate TVs saw flights delayed as passengers refused to board mid-broadcast. In newsrooms, legal teams were called in early, not to vet coverage but to brace for the flood. By 2:37 p.m., 5 major publishing houses had issued official no-comment statements in response to requests about Palin's book deal. HarperCollins, who had offered her the $7 million advance, went dark. Their website crashed under the sudden traffic surge, and journalists began digging into every contract clause, every NDA, every production agreement linked to Sarah Palin's Alaska. Outside the Capitol, a crowd was forming, fast. Word had spread like wildfire that the hearing wasn't just exposing the story of one resignation, but pulling back the curtain on an entire era of myth-making. Some held handwritten signs that read "Truth over Theater." Others brought printed screenshots of the memo Jasmine had revealed, hoisting it like a relic of civic betrayal. The lawn was swelling with reporters, protesters, and stunned tourists who stumbled upon history being rewritten in real time. Inside Twitter headquarters, a server engineer reported the platform had spiked to election night levels of velocity. Hashtag threads weren't just exploding with rage or celebration. They were crawling with lawyers, ethics experts, even former state employees anonymously leaking context beneath the primary posts. One former legislative aide tweeted a damning thread outlining how the ethics complaints had been buried under procedural delay until Palin's resignation disarmed them. That thread alone gained 300,000 likes in less than 15 minutes. It was no longer just a trend. It was a reckoning with the past, forced to the surface under Klieg lights in a streaming feed. Political think tanks began issuing emergency bulletins. The Heritage Foundation called for a pause in politicized commentary while the hearing unfolded. Code for, "This is worse than expected." The Lincoln Project, in contrast, issued a 4-word blast. "We told you so." Capitol Security added 2 more rows of officers outside the hearing room. Not for immediate threat, but in anticipation of a wave of media crews now trying to force physical access. Journalists who'd covered mid-level committee hearings for years suddenly found themselves surrounded by camera trucks and credentialed anchors. Every hallway seemed to buzz with whispered versions of the same thing. "Did you hear what Wexler said? She had the contract before she resigned? Do they have emails? Is this going to force a federal review?" And above all the noise, one label began to crystallize. On social media, on op-eds being written mid-broadcast, on handwritten notes passed between producers and talking heads, a public trial of conscience. The phrase was first coined by a Yale constitutional law professor during a live Skype interview on MSNBC. "This isn't technically a criminal hearing," he said, adjusting his earpiece. "But make no mistake, what you're seeing is the function of democracy at its highest tension point. A trial of truth, televised, a moral reckoning." Within minutes, the term had gone viral. TikTokers began remixing the phrase into digital montages. Clips of Jasmine laying out documents over pounding music. Cuts of Palin blinking under camera glare. Quotes scrolling across the screen like a drumbeat. This is a trial of conscience. By 3:20 p.m., the Associated Press officially revised its headline from Oversight Committee holds ethics discussion to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sparks national firestorm with Palin resignation evidence. Editorial desks across the country issued the same marching order. Drop everything. Run this on page 1. Somewhere deep in the political machinery of the Republican Party, panic had begun to bloom. Anonymous GOP aides, speaking off the record to Politico, admitted that what had begun as a legacy polishing appearance had gone nuclear. Donations were paused. PR teams were called off lunch breaks. Palin's legal representatives, when contacted for comment, issued only a single-sentence reply. Governor Palin stands by her record of service and will address these distortions in due time. But it was too late, because the court of public opinion was already in session. And this wasn't a trial of legal guilt. It was something deeper, more dangerous. This was a trial about truth, and everyone was watching. No verdict had been issued, no formal charges filed. But in living rooms across America, people were no longer talking about Sarah Palin as a public servant. They were talking about Sarah Palin as a brand that in Jasmine Crockett's hands had just been peeled open like a press kit turned inside out. And for the first time in years, Palin didn't control the story. The story controlled her. And just as the weight of public judgment reached its apex, the inevitable crack finally split through the chamber. For hours, Sarah Palin had absorbed the pressure with a veteran's grit. Jaw tightened, smile buried beneath restraint, posture coiled in defiance. But no myth, no matter how rehearsed, could survive this much exposure. Not when hashtags detonated across the country. Not when every camera caught the flinch behind her eyes. Not when every document peeled back another layer of carefully constructed narrative. The room was still, unbearably so. Witnesses had stopped whispering. Lawmakers had stopped flipping through their folders. Even the staffers' fingers hovered above keyboards, paralyzed mid-keystroke. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, back straight, face unreadable, watching not just a witness, but an empire made of television lights and talking points begin to combust in real time. And that's when it happened. Sarah Palin stood up, not subtly, not cautiously, but with the kinetic jolt of someone who had been pushed too close to the fire and finally decided to run straight into it. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor, its legs screaming across marble like a warning shot. She didn't wait to be acknowledged. She didn't ask to be recognized. She didn't care. Her voice sliced into the chamber like a flare, emotional, furious, and trembling on the edge of unraveling. "This," she said, eyes blazing as she gestured toward the panel, the screen, the documents stacked like weapons before her. "This is a coordinated attack, a political ambush, a disgrace." Her hands shook as she pointed toward Jasmine. "I came here to speak on public service. I came here in good faith. But I will not sit here and be insulted, accused, dissected, humiliated on national television." She inhaled sharply, her chest visibly rising with the effort to regain control, but the heat in her words only escalated. "This isn't oversight, it's vengeance. It's political theater, designed not to seek truth, but to destroy reputations. My reputation." Her voice cracked at the edge, and for the first time her anger sounded like desperation dressed as outrage. "And I won't be part of it. I won't sit here and be treated like a criminal for serving my state." The chamber had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that comes after a detonation, not because nothing has happened, but because everything has. And then, with surgical stillness, Jasmine Crockett rose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply stood, elegantly, precisely, like a blade sliding free of its sheath, and met Palin's glare with unflinching calm. Their eyes locked across the table, across the cables and microphones, across the shattered mythology and the mounting evidence. And when Jasmine spoke, it wasn't a rebuttal, it was a scalpel. "You call this an attack, Governor?" Her voice was steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes everyone lean in without realizing they've stopped breathing. "You call this humiliation?" She took a single step forward, the weight of her presence filling the space between them like a closing door. "You say you came here in good faith, but the truth came here with evidence." Now her voice sharpened, not louder, but more exact, every syllable fired like a round of cold steel. "You sat here while the nation watched documents with your signature, emails, contracts, memos from your own state's legal office, all laid bare." She paused just long enough to let the silence ripple like thunder on the horizon. "And now you call the facts insults?" Jasmine leaned in, not physically but vocally, her tone dropping into a blade-thin register. "So tell me, Governor, do you consider the truth to be a form of disrespect?" The room didn't erupt. It imploded. Emotion didn't pour out. It froze in place, encased in tension too thick to cut. Palin stood still, her mouth parted just slightly. The retort she had clearly prepared caught somewhere between her breath and her pride. But the moment she had seized, standing up, declaring war, accusing the process of betrayal, had already been stolen by the weight of those final words. "Do you consider the truth to be a form of disrespect?" It was not a question. It was a verdict. One carved into silence, aired live to the country, stamped onto every social media feed with captions that burned. The cameras captured it all. Jasmine's gaze clear and calm as iron, Palin's eyes wide but hollow, as though realizing too late that she had overplayed a defense against something that could not be spun, evaded, or shouted down. Not anymore. And as the moment stretched on, the chamber took on the aura of something no longer political, no longer procedural, but spiritual. This was no longer a debate between two women. It was a national exorcism of pretense, a confrontation between legacy and accountability, myth and memory. Then came the sound of a single camera flash, then another, and another. Reporters were already composing headlines in their minds. "Palin explodes. Crockett eviscerates. Truth isn't an insult. Congresswoman's line shakes hearing to its core." But Jasmine wasn't thinking about headlines. She was thinking about the millions watching, the young woman in Alaska who once believed in a leader, the civil servant who kept showing up while her governor disappeared into book deals and production trailers. She was thinking about truth, the kind too often dismissed as anger, too often called impolite when spoken by women who refused to bow. She didn't sit. She let the silence stretch one moment longer. Let Palin stand there, shaking with anger that no longer had anywhere to go. And she added, softer this time, but even more lethal, "If facts feel like an attack, maybe the problem isn't the facts." That was it. The hearing hadn't adjourned. No gavel had dropped. But the battle, that moment of public collision between narrative and evidence, defiance and accountability, was over. And the room, the country, and history itself knew exactly who had walked out of it with the truth on her side. And after the firestorm, the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention, but demands judgment. Sarah Palin was still standing, lips parted, fists clenched, but motionless, caught in the center of her own unraveling. Her final protest now floated like ash in the air, smoldering but powerless. The room had not moved. Neither had the millions watching at home. The cameras remained locked, the microphones hot, the nation suspended in a moment too full to breathe. And that's when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward. No chaos, no dramatic overture. Just a single step, and with it, the weight of every word she was about to deliver. Her heels echoed across the chamber floor with a deliberate, measured cadence. She didn't need volume to command the room. The air had already bent toward her. Every lens followed, every back straightened. She was not stepping into position. She was stepping into history. In her left hand, she held the folder, the same one that had contained every contract, every memo, every page of redacted strategy that had exposed the core of Palin's exit for what it was. In her right, she held nothing at all, because the truth needs no props. It only needs a voice. She paused just before the microphone, let the weight of her stillness pierce through every screen, then lifted her eyes. The entire room leaned in, not forward, but inward, toward the space where fiction had just collapsed and truth now waited to speak. Her voice, when it came, was steady, not righteous, not angry, just clear, like a verdict being read by someone who had seen this coming long before the crowd ever did. Leadership is not about standing in front of cameras. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe between lines. She simply delivered them, with the cadence of conviction, not performance. Leadership is staying when everything around you is falling apart. A pause, just enough to let the truth reverberate. Just enough to let every viewer at home remember the faces of the nurses laid off in Alaska. The roads never paved. The community programs that had gone dark when their governor walked away without warning. And you, she turned slightly toward Palin now, but didn't raise her tone. You didn't stay. You didn't fight. You left. Her fingers tapped once against the folder. No need to open it again. Everyone already knew what was inside. The nation had seen it. You left not to protect the people, not to spare them chaos, not because you had to. A beat. You left for profit. The last word didn't land like a hammer. It landed like a scalpel. Precise, cold, undeniable. She didn't inflect it with scorn. She let it carry its own gravity, because by now the numbers had already spoken. The $7 million book deal, the $1.25 million TV show, the timeline that connected resignation to revenue like dots on a map. Then she stepped back from the mic, just 1 inch, and let the silence consume the chamber once more. But it wasn't empty now. It was alive with consequence. No one applauded. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't dare. No camera clicked. Not a single lens shuddered. The silence was total. The kind of silence that doesn't ask a question, it answers one. It renders judgment. It is the sound of a myth collapsing in real time. Somewhere in the back, a staffer dropped a pen, and it rolled across the marble with an almost surreal clarity. Every head turned. Even that sound felt loud. Palin did not speak. She had no rebuttal prepared for that. Because what do you say when the accusation is not political, not personal, but moral? When the nation no longer sees you as the victim, but as the architect of your own fall? Jasmine remained still, eyes fixed, breath even, posture straight. She didn't gloat. She didn't flinch. Because this was never about destroying a woman. It was about confronting a lie. And now that lie lay exposed beneath the lights of the Capitol, burned into the collective consciousness of a country that had followed Palin's rise, swallowed her narrative, and now stood face to face with the receipts. The folder in Jasmine's hand dipped slightly, like the closing of a book after its final chapter. But no one moved, because it wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of truth, finally spoken without apology. And when the silence finally ended, it did not fade. It detonated. By morning, the nation hadn't moved on. It had awakened into a different political reality. The images from the hearing, looped endlessly across every major news network, had become something more than footage. They had become symbol. Jasmine Crockett standing tall, folder in hand. Palin frozen mid-sentence, her legacy hanging like cracked glass. No spin room could reverse the damage now. The truth wasn't a story anymore. It was a verdict. Inside Palin's camp, panic hit like a second storm. Her morning press tour, a full slate of interviews scheduled with Fox and Friends, Newsmax, The Daily Wire, and a pre-taped sit-down with a major national magazine, was obliterated before sunrise. At 7:04 a.m., her communications director issued a terse statement. In light of yesterday's events, Governor Palin will be pausing all media appearances until further notice. No further comment, no clarification, no fight, just silence. And the media pounced. By 8 a.m., the headlines had gone fully scorched earth. The Washington Post ran with, "The day the spotlight shattered, Palin silenced after Crockett's devastating exposure." The New York Times was sharper, colder, more surgical. Jasmine Crockett dismantles the Palin myth, live in without mercy. Politico didn't mince words. This wasn't a hearing. It was a political autopsy. But it was The Atlantic that delivered the line destined for textbooks. Jasmine Crockett didn't debate Sarah Palin. She ended the era she created. Online, the reaction was apocalyptic. In under 12 hours, over 20 million people had viewed the clip of Jasmine's closing line, reposted by news accounts, celebrities, historians, and even former Republican staffers. Influencers across TikTok and Instagram had cut it into music-backed montages, slow zooms on Palin's stunned expression, overlaid with Jasmine's now iconic line. "You didn't leave for the people. You left for the payout." Hashtags surged again. Crockett truth, Palin exit exposed, and leadership is staying trended simultaneously. Twitter servers flagged a national spike alert, a feature typically reserved for election nights or major Supreme Court rulings. This wasn't just trending. It was engraving itself onto the political consciousness. Cable networks doubled down. MSNBC cleared their entire 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. block, replaying the full testimony in prime time with no commercial breaks. CNN's panel called the moment the political equivalent of a controlled demolition. Even Fox News, Palin's usual stronghold, could no longer shield her under talking points. One host, visibly pale, offered, "This is not the Sarah Palin our viewers remember." By midday, polling firms launched emergency overnight surveys to measure the damage. The results, when they hit, were seismic. 85% of registered voters, including 61% of self-identified conservatives, stated that they now believe Palin had resigned for personal or financial reasons, not public service. The number was even higher, 92%, among voters under 40. That wasn't erosion, that was collapse. In a coordinated flood of front pages, newspapers from coast to coast echoed the same consensus. USA Today led with a single black and white still. Jasmine's back turned toward the cameras, walking away from the witness stand, the headline stamped beneath it like a funeral bell. She spoke. We listened. In Alaska, the fallout was nuclear. Local news stations that had once elevated Palin as a hometown hero now opened broadcasts with apology segments. KTVA Anchorage ran an 8-minute special re-examining the last 6 months of Palin's governorship. Now armed with the documents revealed by Crockett. "We knew she left," the anchor said somberly, "but we didn't understand why. Now we do." Calls flooded in to the Alaska State Ethics Board. Demands for a retroactive audit. Letters to the editor flooded small-town papers. Even former campaign donors, once proud to be associated with her name, scrambled to distance themselves from what was quickly becoming a cautionary tale of self-serving ambition masquerading as sacrifice. Back in Washington, reporters swarmed outside Palin's temporary residence. No sign of her emerged. Curtains drawn, lights off. The woman who once dominated rallies, book tours, and cable interviews had gone silent. Voluntarily, or perhaps by force of consequence. And inside political strategy rooms across the Capitol, the lesson was sinking in. Truth, when presented without apology, without distraction, could still burn everything down. Not with fury, but with precision. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett refused interviews. She declined all invitations to appear on evening shows or join celebratory panels. Her staff issued a single tweet from her account. 12 words that now live etched into history books and political timelines alike. "Leadership is staying when it's hard. That's all I came to say." It was retweeted 1.4 million times in under 6 hours, because it wasn't just a quote anymore. It was a line drawn in the sand, a new standard, a rebuke to every hollow speech, every well-lit resignation, every press conference designed to distract from what was left undone. By nightfall, Americans weren't just talking about what had happened. They were asking who would be next. But in this moment, the silence that had begun in that Capitol chamber had echoed outward, across every newsroom, phone screen, dinner table, and headline, not as an absence of noise, but as a nation holding its breath at the sight of one legacy falling. and the truth rising to take its place. And when the applause never came, when even the cameras hesitated to move, a strange thing happened. The silence became holy. Not in the sacred sense, but in the way a battlefield becomes hallowed after the smoke clears, when the living realize something irreversible has occurred. The air in the chamber wasn't just still, it was stunned. Not because someone had shouted, not because someone had fallen, but because someone had finally told the truth, and nothing happened to stop her. That was the lesson, and it wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the trending hashtags or the looping clips of Jasmine Crockett's voice delivering those final words. You didn't leave for the people, you left for the payout. The true impact lay beneath the surface in what her presence symbolized. It was about the cost of being right before the world is ready to admit it. Because truth tellers are not born, they're built. And they are built slowly, painfully, forged in rooms where they are spoken over, dismissed, tolerated only when silent, and celebrated only when obedient. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand in that hearing as a rising star. She stood there as a survivor of every closed door, every mic cut short, every headline that failed to name what it really was. This wasn't just political theater, it was emotional excavation. And the reason her words hit so hard, so deeply, wasn't just because they exposed a lie. It was because they exposed how long that lie had been allowed to breathe. How many people had known, suspected, looked the other way. How many benefited, how many shrugged, and how often women like Jasmine are told to wait their turn, to let the lie retire on its own terms. But Jasmine didn't wait, because silence for her had never been neutral. It had always been a wait, a compromise, a slow erasure. And on that day, she made the choice, not just to speak, but to speak when it mattered most. When the story was already written, the cameras already framed, the headlines preloaded with spin. She walked into a room built to defend legacy and tore through it with documentation and steel-eyed calm. She knew what they would call her, they always do. Aggressive, disrespectful, too much, but she came anyway. And what she brought with her wasn't anger, it was accumulation. Years of watching people in power rewrite the record. Years of watching accountability defined by who could afford to escape it. Years of watching women, especially women who look like her, forced to hold the weight of truth in whispers because the world doesn't listen until they bleed to be heard. That was the real story beneath the broadcast. Not that Sarah Palin was exposed, but that the machinery of America's political memory was forced, at least once, to stop and listen to the voice it had been trained to overlook. Jasmine's presence shattered more than Palin's narrative. It shattered the belief that truth must come wrapped in politeness to be respected. It shattered the false peace we mistake for unity. And it shattered the notion that leadership is a performance, not a responsibility. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She didn't lecture. She laid out receipts. She laid out patterns. She laid out consequences. And when the smoke cleared, she didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't claim victory. Because this wasn't a win. It was a wound finally exposed to air. The injustice she faced wasn't just systemic. It was personal. Every line she spoke had to be perfect. Every document vetted. Every pause intentional. Because one misplaced breath and the room would have turned. One wrong word and her credibility would have been set on fire. But she didn't misstep. She didn't flinch. Because she knew what was at stake wasn't her image, but the idea that truth itself could still stand up in a room full of denial and not be buried alive. That is the human cost behind what millions called iconic. Behind the memes, the standing ovations online, the op-eds hailing her as the new face of moral courage. Those things came after. But during, she stood alone. She stood knowing that power would try to punish her for exposing its theater. She stood knowing that the backlash wouldn't just be loud, it would be targeted. And she stood knowing that for every headline applauding her today, there would be voices tomorrow questioning her tone, her timing, her motives. But she did it anyway, because someone had to say it. Someone had to say that leadership isn't about cameras, that walking away in a storm isn't noble when the storm was created to avoid accountability, That being first means nothing if it ends in betrayal. That America does not need more stories, it needs more truth. The real moral of that hearing, the one no Chiron could summarize, was that truth, when told plainly, has the power to eclipse every illusion. It doesn't always come with applause. Often it comes with silence, a silence thick with shame, a silence that is, in itself, a confession. And Jasmine Crockett carried that silence like armor. She gave the country a gift it didn't ask for, the discomfort of clarity, and in return she asked for nothing. No book deal, no cable contract, no parade. She walked out the way she came in, with a folder in hand and a spine unshaken. The real lesson wasn't about Palin. It wasn't even about resignation. It was about what it means to hold the line when no one wants it held, to stay when others leave, to speak when truth becomes dangerous, and to do it anyway, because it's right, not because it's easy. That's what Jasmine taught the world. That's what will outlast the headlines. That's what history will remember, not just the moment she stood, but what she stood for. The echo of Jasmine's final words had barely faded when the nation began to reflect, not just on Sarah Palin's unraveling narrative, but on the deeper, more uncomfortable truths it revealed about power, accountability, and the cost of telling the truth. The tension didn't evaporate, it settled into something more enduring, reckoning. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but the weight of what had been said lingered in every hallway, every news segment, every family dinner where someone whispered, "Did you see what she did?" And for all the noise that politics usually makes, this time, it was the silence afterward that delivered the loudest message. Jasmine never set out to humiliate anyone. What she exposed was bigger than a single figure. She had confronted an entire culture that rewards charm over character, escape over endurance, storytelling over service. And in doing so, she reminded a fractured nation that leadership isn't about image, it's about sacrifice. She reminded everyone watching that truth is often quiet, lonely, and dangerous. That speaking up, especially when it's inconvenient, is the highest form of public service. And that courage isn't found in applause, but in choosing to stay seated when you're expected to walk away. For millions watching, the lesson wasn't political, it was deeply human. No legacy is untouchable, and no lie, no matter how elegantly dressed, can survive the weight of truth, told plainly. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.